Sarah Martinez had always been small for her age. At 23, she stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed just over 100 pounds. Her fellow Marines often joked that she could hide behind a flagpole, but nobody questioned her determination. She had joined the Marines 3 years ago, driven by a desire to serve her country and prove that size didn't determine strength. The forward operating base in Afghanistan was her first real deployment. Camp Phoenix sat in a dusty valley surrounded by rocky hills that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The heat was unbearable during the day, often reaching over 100 degrees, while nights brought a cold that cut through even the thickest blankets. Sarah worked as a communications specialist, maintaining radio equipment and ensuring that vital messages reached their destinations. Her days started before dawn with physical training, followed by equipment checks and long hours monitoring radio frequencies. The work was demanding, but Sarah thrived on the responsibility. She knew that clear communication could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers operating in the field. Her small hands were perfect for the delicate work of repairing circuit boards and adjusting antenna arrays. The other Marines in her unit had initially been skeptical about having such a small woman among them. Some worried she wouldn't be able to keep up during long marches or handle the physical demands of military life. However, Sarah quickly proved herself through her technical skills and unwavering dedication. She volunteered for extra duties, helped others with their equipment problems, and never complained about the harsh conditions. Corporal James Thompson was one of the first to accept Sarah as an equal. He was a massive man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing over 200 pounds. Despite his intimidating appearance, James had a gentle personality and often acted as a big brother to the younger Marines. He had been in Afghanistan for 8 months and was known for his leadership skills and calm demeanor under pressure. James and Sarah developed a strong friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences. They often worked together on communication equipment, with James providing the muscle while Sarah handled the technical aspects. During their free time, they would sit together and talk about their families back home, their dreams for the future, and the challenges they faced in this foreign land. The base had been relatively quiet for several weeks, with only occasional reports of distant explosions or small arms fire. The Marines maintained their vigilance, but the routine of daily operations had settled into a predictable pattern. Morning briefings covered the same security concerns, patrol routes remained unchanged, and the threat level stayed at a constant state of cautious alertness. Sarah spent most of her time in the communications bunker, a reinforced concrete structure buried partially underground. The bunker was cramped and poorly ventilated, filled with banks of radio equipment, computer terminals, and miles of cables. Multiple screens displayed maps, weather data, and status reports from units scattered across the region. The constant hum of cooling fans and electronic equipment created a background noise that became almost comforting over time. On quiet afternoons, Sarah would sometimes step outside the bunker to get fresh air and check the antenna arrays mounted on the roof. The view from the communications building showed the entire base spread out below, with rows of tents, vehicle parks, and defensive positions. Beyond the perimeter, the Afghan landscape stretched endlessly, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The local Afghan workers who helped maintain the base had grown accustomed to seeing Sarah around the communications equipment. They respected her technical knowledge and often brought their own electronic devices for her to repair. These small interactions helped bridge the cultural divide and created moments of human connection amid the tension of military operations. Sarah's family back in Texas worried constantly about her safety. Her mother called the base whenever possible, though the time difference and security restrictions made regular communication difficult. During these calls, Sarah always tried to sound upbeat and confident, never mentioning the dangers or the loneliness she sometimes felt. She wanted her family to be proud of her service, not worried about her safety. The medical facility at Camp Phoenix was staffed by dedicated doctors and nurses who treated everything from minor injuries to serious combat wounds. Sarah had visited the medical tent only once for a routine vaccination update, but she had great respect for the medical personnel who worked tirelessly to care for injured soldiers. The head nurse, Lieutenant Patricia Collins, was particularly admired by everyone on the base for her skill and compassion. As autumn approached, intelligence reports suggested increased insurgent activity in the surrounding area. The base commander implemented additional security measures, including more frequent patrols and enhanced perimeter defenses. Sarah noticed the change in atmosphere as Marines became more alert, and conversations grew more serious. The easy camaraderie of the quiet weeks gave way to a heightened sense of awareness and preparation. Training exercises became more intensive, with scenarios designed to test the base's response to various types of attacks. Sarah participated in these drills, learning evacuation procedures and emergency protocols. She practiced moving quickly between buildings while carrying essential communication equipment, knowing that maintaining contact with higher headquarters could be crucial during an emergency. The weapons training that all Marines received, regardless of their primary job, took on new importance as the security situation evolved. Sarah spent extra time at the firing range, improving her marksmanship and practicing tactical movements. Her small size actually proved advantageous in some situations, allowing her to take cover behind obstacles that wouldn't protect larger Marines. Despite the increasing tension, life on the base continued with its daily routines. Meals in the dining facility provided opportunities for Marines to relax and socialize. Sarah enjoyed these breaks from her technical duties, listening to stories from other Marines and sharing news from home. The bonds formed during these casual interactions would prove crucial in the challenging days ahead. The communication equipment required constant maintenance in the harsh Afghan environment. Dust storms could damage sensitive electronics, extreme temperatures caused components to fail, and the vibrations from nearby helicopter landings sometimes loosened connections. Sarah took pride in keeping everything operational, knowing that lives depended on reliable communication systems. As evening approached on what would become one of the most significant days of her life, Sarah completed her routine equipment checks and prepared for the night shift. She had no way of knowing that within hours, her small frame would be called upon to perform an act of courage that would earn the respect and admiration of 500 Marines and change her life forever. The attack came without warning at 3:30 in the morning. Sarah was alone in the communications bunker, monitoring radio traffic from patrol units scattered across the valley. The first explosion shook the entire building, sending equipment crashing to the floor and knocking out power to half the communication systems. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the room filled with sparking electronics and scattered papers. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She grabbed the emergency radio and attempted to contact the command post, but static filled the airwaves. The backup generators should have activated by now, but something was wrong. Through the reinforced windows she could see flashes of light and hear the distinctive whistle of incoming rockets. The base was under coordinated attack from multiple directions. More explosions rocked the building as Sarah worked frantically to restore communications. Her hands moved quickly across the control panels, switching to backup systems and rerouting power through undamaged circuits. The acrid smell of smoke began filtering into the bunker, and she realized that fires had started in several buildings across the base. The attack was more intense than anything the intelligence reports had predicted. The emergency protocols called for all non-essential personnel to move to designated safe areas, but Sarah couldn't abandon her post. The communication systems were the lifeline for Marines operating outside the base perimeter. Without radio contact, patrol units would be operating blind, unable to call for support or coordinate their movements. She had to keep working, even as the building shook with each nearby explosion. James Thompson was supposed to be sleeping in his quarters on the other side of the base, but the explosions had awakened everyone. He grabbed his weapon and gear, rushing toward his assigned defensive position along the eastern perimeter. The scene outside was chaos, with Marines running between buildings while tracer rounds lit up the night sky. Vehicle alarms were sounding, and emergency sirens added to the cacophony of battle. As James moved through the darkness, he could see that the attackers had infiltrated the base perimeter in several locations. Muzzle flashes indicated firefights near the motor pool and the main gate. The coordinated nature of the attack suggested careful planning and detailed knowledge of the base layout. This wasn't a random assault, but a sophisticated operation designed to cause maximum damage. The medical facility immediately began preparing for casualties. Lieutenant Collins and her team worked quickly to set up additional treatment areas and organize medical supplies. They knew from experience that the next few hours would test their skills and endurance to the limit. The sound of helicopters approaching indicated that medical evacuation flights were already being prepared. Back in the communications bunker, Sarah had managed to restore partial contact with the outside world. She could hear desperate calls from patrol units requesting immediate extraction, and reports of casualties mounting across the base. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she coordinated between ground units, air support, and medical teams. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her small shoulders as she realized how many lives depended on her ability to maintain these vital connections. The attack intensified as insurgents launched a second wave of rockets and mortars. One explosion struck dangerously close to the communications building, shattering windows and sending debris flying through the bunker. Sarah felt blood trickling down her face from small cuts, but she continued working. The main communication array on the roof had been damaged, reducing her transmission range significantly. James reached his defensive position just as enemy fighters attempted to breach the perimeter fence. He could see muzzle flashes in the darkness beyond the razor wire and immediately began returning fire. His squad leader was coordinating defensive actions through a handheld radio, but the signal was weak and intermittent. They needed better communication with the command post to effectively coordinate their response. The base commander was trying to assess the situation from the command bunker, but reports were coming in slowly due to communication problems. He knew that patrol units outside the perimeter were in immediate danger and needed to be warned about the attack. The enemy had clearly planned this assault to coincide with ongoing operations, hoping to catch Marines away from the relative safety of the base. Sarah noticed that the main communication line to higher headquarters had been severed. Without this connection, the base was isolated from potential reinforcements and air support. She began working on an alternative solution, using satellite communication equipment that was normally reserved for emergency situations. The process was complex and time-consuming, but it represented their best hope for re-establishing contact with the outside world. Another massive explosion rocked the base, this time much closer to the communications building. Sarah felt the floor shake violently beneath her feet, and several more pieces of equipment went offline. Through the damaged windows, she could see that a fuel storage area had been hit, creating a massive fireball that illuminated the entire base. The heat from the flames could be felt even inside the bunker. The enemy assault team had studied the base layout carefully, targeting critical infrastructure to maximize disruption. The fuel depot explosion was intended to create chaos and limit the Marines' ability to operate vehicles and aircraft. Secondary explosions continued as stored ammunition and fuel supplies caught fire, adding to the confusion and danger. James and his squad were engaged in fierce fighting along the eastern perimeter. The enemy fighters were well equipped and disciplined, using coordinated tactics that suggested professional military training. They had night vision equipment and sophisticated weapons, making them formidable opponents in the darkness. The Marines were holding their positions, but ammunition was running low. The medical facility was receiving its first casualties as wounded Marines were brought in from the perimeter defenses. Lieutenant Collins worked quickly to triage the injured, determining who needed immediate surgery and who could wait for treatment. The sound of gunfire and explosions outside created a constant backdrop of tension as the medical team focused on saving lives. Sarah finally managed to establish satellite communication with headquarters, but the connection was weak and intermittent. She could barely make out the voices on the other end, but she managed to transmit a brief status report about the attack. The response indicated that reinforcements were being mobilized, but it would take hours for significant help to arrive. The Marines at Camp Phoenix were essentially on their own for the immediate future. The intensity of the firefight was beginning to take its toll on the defenders. Several positions had reported casualties, and ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. The enemy seemed to have unlimited resources and was pressing their attack with increasing aggression. James could see movement in the shadows beyond the perimeter, suggesting that another wave of attackers was preparing to assault their position. As dawn approached, the situation became increasingly desperate. The communications building had taken several direct hits, and Sarah was working with severely damaged equipment. Smoke filled the bunker, making it difficult to breathe and see the control panels clearly. She knew that maintaining communications was crucial for the survival of everyone on the base, but the equipment was failing faster than she could repair it. The enemy had achieved their tactical objectives of disrupting communications and creating chaos throughout the base. However, the Marines were beginning to organize an effective defense despite the initial confusion. Squad leaders were coordinating their actions through short-range radios, and defensive positions were being reinforced with additional ammunition and personnel. Sarah realized that the communication problems were preventing effective coordination of the defense. She made a critical decision to abandon the damaged bunker and attempt to reach an alternative communication site on the other side of the base. This would require crossing open ground under enemy fire, but it might be the only way to restore full communications and save the Marines fighting desperately to defend their positions. Sarah grabbed the portable radio equipment and essential communication codes, stuffing them into a heavy backpack. The alternative communication site was located in a hardened bunker near the command post, about 400 yards across open ground. She knew the route was exposed to enemy fire, but the main communication systems were failing rapidly, and the Marines needed reliable contact with air support and reinforcements. As she prepared to leave the bunker, another explosion nearby shattered the remaining windows and filled the air with concrete dust. Sarah coughed violently, her eyes watering from the debris and smoke. The building's structural integrity was compromised, and she could hear metal groaning and concrete cracking above her head. Staying inside was no longer an option. The scene outside was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during training exercises. Tracer rounds streaked across the compound in both directions, creating deadly light shows against the darkness. Buildings were burning throughout the base, and the constant sound of gunfire mixed with shouted orders and the screams of wounded Marines. The enemy had achieved surprise and was pressing their advantage with overwhelming firepower. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped out into the chaos. She stayed low, using whatever cover she could find as she moved toward the command bunker. The backpack full of communication equipment weighed almost as much as she did, but she forced herself to keep moving. Every few steps, she had to duck behind vehicles, concrete barriers, or burning debris as bullets whined overhead. James was still fighting at the eastern perimeter when he saw a small figure moving across the compound. Through his night vision scope, he recognized Sarah carrying the heavy communication equipment. He realized immediately what she was trying to do and admired her courage, but he also knew how dangerous her route would be. Enemy snipers had taken positions in the hills overlooking the base and had clear fields of fire across the open areas. The portable radio crackled with urgent messages from patrol units, requesting immediate extraction. Several Marines were trapped outside the base perimeter, pinned down by enemy fire and running low on ammunition. Without reliable communication links, the command post couldn't coordinate rescue operations or provide accurate targeting information for close air support. Sarah's mission was crucial for saving these isolated Marines. Halfway across the compound, Sarah dove behind a damaged truck as a burst of automatic weapons fire tore up the ground where she had been walking. She could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her head, and she pressed herself against the vehicle's steel frame. The communication equipment had shifted in her backpack, and the straps were cutting into her shoulders. But she couldn't stop to readjust the load. The enemy fighters had infiltrated deeper into the base than initial reports indicated. Small teams were moving between buildings, targeting key personnel and infrastructure. They had studied the base layout extensively and knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. The communication building, fuel depot, and medical facility had all been priority targets in their assault plan. Lieutenant Collins was working frantically in the medical facility as more wounded Marines arrived. The building had been hit twice by rocket-propelled grenades, but the medical team continued operating despite the damage. Several nurses had been injured by flying debris, but they refused to abandon their posts. The sound of gunfire outside was getting closer, indicating that enemy fighters were approaching their sector. Sarah reached the halfway point of her dangerous journey when she spotted movement in a damaged building to her left. Enemy fighters had established a firing position there and were targeting anyone attempting to cross the open ground. She realized that her route was being observed and that the next section would be even more dangerous than what she had already traversed. The base's defensive systems were beginning to respond more effectively as commanders gained better understanding of the enemy attack patterns. Machine gun positions were repositioned to provide better coverage of likely infiltration routes, and ammunition was redistributed to areas under the heaviest pressure. However, without proper communications, these defensive adjustments were being made too slowly to counter the well-coordinated enemy assault. James received orders through his squad radio to attempt linking up with other defensive positions, but the transmission was garbled and incomplete. He could see that enemy fighters were attempting to flank his position, but he couldn't warn adjacent units about the threat. The communication breakdown was allowing the enemy to exploit gaps in the defensive perimeter that would normally be covered by coordinated fire. Sarah sprinted across another open area, her lungs burning from the effort and the smoke-filled air. The communication equipment bounced heavily against her back with each step, throwing off her balance and slowing her progress. She could hear shouts behind her in a foreign language, indicating that enemy fighters had spotted her movement and were attempting to intercept her route. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded against a building just 20 feet from Sarah's position, showering her with concrete fragments and metal debris. The blast wave knocked her to the ground and she felt a sharp pain in her left shoulder where a piece of shrapnel had struck her. Blood began soaking through her uniform, but she forced herself back to her feet and continued toward the command bunker. The command post was coordinating defensive operations as best they could with limited information. Radio reports were sporadic and often contradictory, making it difficult to assess the true extent of the enemy penetration. The base commander knew that air support was available, but he couldn't provide accurate targeting coordinates without better communication links to forward observers. Enemy mortar rounds began falling in a systematic pattern across the base, indicating that the attackers had professional artillery support. The explosions walked steadily toward the command bunker, forcing personnel to take cover in reinforced positions. Sarah realized that she was running out of time to establish communications before the command post itself came under direct attack. The medical facility received a direct hit from a mortar round, partially collapsing one wall and destroying several treatment stations. Lieutenant Collins and her team worked to evacuate patients to safer areas while continuing to treat new casualties. Several medical personnel had been injured in the attack, but they continued working despite their wounds. The facility's backup communication system had been destroyed, cutting their link to medical evacuation helicopters. Sarah was within 100 yards of the command bunker when she encountered the most dangerous part of her journey. The open ground ahead was completely exposed to enemy observation, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple firing positions. The communication equipment on her back made her an obvious target, and she knew that enemy fighters would concentrate their fire on anyone attempting to reach the command post. James watched Sarah's progress through his scope and made a decision that would violate his orders but might save her life. He began providing covering fire toward the enemy positions that threatened her route, drawing their attention away from the small figure struggling across the compound. His accurate shooting forced several enemy fighters to take cover, creating a brief window of opportunity. The base's fuel dump continued burning out of control, creating a massive pillar of black smoke that could be seen for miles. The fire illuminated the entire compound, eliminating the natural concealment that darkness would normally provide. This worked against both sides, but the enemy had prepared for fighting in these conditions, while the Marines were adapting to circumstances they hadn't fully anticipated. Sarah's shoulder wound was bleeding more heavily now, and she could feel her strength beginning to fade. The communication equipment seemed to grow heavier with each step, and her vision was becoming blurry from blood loss and exhaustion. She knew that reaching the command bunker was crucial, not just for establishing communications, but for the survival of every Marine on the base. An enemy sniper's bullet struck the ground inches from Sarah's feet, kicking up a spray of dirt and gravel. She zigzagged desperately, trying to present a more difficult target while maintaining her forward momentum. The command bunker was now clearly visible ahead, but the final 50 yards would require crossing completely open ground with no cover whatsoever. The sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance, indicating that air support was finally arriving. However, without proper communication links, the pilots couldn't receive targeting information or coordinate with ground forces. Sarah's mission had become even more critical, as powerful weapon systems waited overhead for instructions that couldn't be transmitted through the damaged communication network. Sarah reached the entrance to the command bunker just as another mortar round exploded nearby, the blast wave slamming her against the reinforced concrete wall. Her ears were ringing and blood trickled down her face from new cuts, but she had made it. The heavy steel door opened and hands reached out to pull her inside to safety. The communication equipment had survived the dangerous journey, though several components showed damage from the explosions and debris. Inside the command bunker, the atmosphere was tense and chaotic. Officers were trying to coordinate defensive operations with incomplete information, while radio operators struggled with failing equipment and poor signal quality. Sarah immediately began setting up the portable communication systems she had carried across the compound, her hands working automatically despite her wounds and exhaustion. The base commander, Colonel Williams, recognized Sarah immediately and understood the significance of her dangerous mission. He had been trying to establish contact with air support units circling overhead, but the damaged communication systems couldn't handle the complex radio frequencies required for close air support coordination. Sarah's equipment represented their best hope for turning the tide of the battle. As Sarah connected the portable systems to the bunker's power supply and antenna arrays, she could hear the desperate radio calls from Marines trapped outside the perimeter. Several patrol units had been cut off during the initial attack and were now surrounded by enemy forces. Without immediate air support and coordinated rescue operations, these Marines would not survive until dawn. James was still fighting at the eastern perimeter when he received fragmented radio instructions to fall back to secondary defensive positions. The enemy had breached the outer fence in several locations and was establishing firing positions inside the base perimeter. His squad was running dangerously low on ammunition, and several Marines had been wounded by enemy fire and shrapnel from explosions. The medical facility had been evacuated to the underground emergency treatment center after sustaining multiple direct hits. Lieutenant Collins and her team were working in cramped conditions with limited supplies, but they continued treating wounded Marines as fast as they could. The backup communication system in the medical bunker was functioning, but it could only handle local traffic within the base. Sarah's portable equipment successfully established contact with the circling aircraft, and she immediately began coordinating close air support missions. Her voice was steady and professional despite her injuries and the chaos surrounding her. She provided precise targeting coordinates for enemy positions and guided attack helicopters to areas where their firepower would be most effective against the infiltrating fighters. The first airstrikes hit enemy positions in the hills overlooking the base, eliminating several sniper teams and mortar positions. The explosions lit up the darkness and temporarily reduced the incoming fire that had been suppressing Marine defensive positions. However, enemy fighters inside the base perimeter continued to pose a serious threat, and air support couldn't engage them without risking casualties among friendly forces. Colonel Williams realized that the communication link Sarah had established was working perfectly, but maintaining it required constant attention and technical expertise. The portable equipment was not designed for extended operations and needed frequent adjustments to maintain signal quality. Sarah was the only person on the base with the knowledge and experience to keep these critical systems operational. The enemy assault was beginning to lose momentum as air support eliminated their external fire support positions. However, the fighters who had infiltrated the base were well armed and determined to cause maximum damage before withdrawing. They had established positions in several key buildings and were proving difficult to dislodge without heavy weapons that might damage critical infrastructure. Sarah coordinated between ground units and air support, directing helicopter gunships to engage enemy positions that could be safely targeted. Her technical skills and calm demeanor under pressure impressed everyone in the command bunker. Despite her small size and obvious exhaustion, she was performing at the highest level of professional competence when the Marines needed her most. James and his squad received orders to move to a new defensive position near the motor pool, where enemy fighters had established a stronghold. The movement required crossing open ground under fire, but air support guided by Sarah's communications was providing covering fire to suppress enemy positions. The coordination between air and ground units was finally working effectively. The rescue of trapped patrol units began as soon as Sarah established reliable communication links with medical evacuation helicopters. She coordinated complex operations involving multiple aircraft, ground units, and medical teams simultaneously. Her ability to manage these overlapping missions while maintaining calm professionalism earned the respect of every officer in the command bunker. Lieutenant Collins received word, through the restored communication network, that medical evacuation flights were incoming to transport the most seriously wounded Marines to better-equipped hospitals. She began preparing patients for transport while coordinating with flight crews about landing zones and patient conditions. The improved communications made these complex medical operations much safer and more efficient. The portable communication equipment was showing signs of strain from extended high-power operations. Sarah noticed several components were overheating and worked quickly to implement cooling measures and redistribute the electrical load. She knew that losing communications now would be catastrophic for the ongoing rescue operations and defensive coordination. Enemy fighters launched one final coordinated assault on the command bunker, recognizing that disrupting communications was their last chance to achieve tactical success. Rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons fire concentrated on the bunker's entrance and communication antennas. Sarah continued working at her equipment as explosions shook the building and debris fell from the ceiling. Colonel Williams ordered additional security around the command bunker, but most available Marines were already engaged in defensive operations elsewhere on the base. The few guards stationed at the bunker would have to hold off any direct assault, while Sarah maintained the critical communication links that were enabling effective resistance throughout the base. The sound of approaching helicopters indicated that reinforcements were finally arriving, but they needed precise landing zone information and coordination with ground units to avoid landing in areas still under enemy fire. Sarah worked to establish contact with the incoming aircraft while simultaneously managing ongoing air support missions and rescue operations. James received orders to lead his squad in an assault on enemy positions near the communication building, which had been the original source of the base's communication problems. The mission was dangerous, but eliminating these fighters would help secure the area and potentially allow repair of the main communication systems. Sarah's portable equipment had proven invaluable, but restoring full communication capability was essential for long-term operations. The enemy fighters in the motor pool had been eliminated by coordinated air and ground attacks, but several other strongholds remained throughout the base. Sarah directed air support to engage these positions systematically, working with ground commanders to ensure that friendly forces were clear of target areas before weapons were released. As dawn approached, the tactical situation was improving significantly. Enemy forces outside the base perimeter had been largely eliminated by airstrikes, and the fighters inside the base were being systematically hunted down by Marine ground units. However, the night's fighting had taken a heavy toll, with numerous casualties and extensive damage to base infrastructure. Sarah had been working continuously for over 4 hours, maintaining communication links that had proven crucial for the base's survival. Her shoulder wound had stopped bleeding, but she was clearly exhausted and operating on pure determination. The portable equipment was still functioning, but several components were operating beyond their design limits and could fail at any moment. The medical evacuation operations had successfully transported the most critically wounded Marines to hospitals, and casualty collection points were being established for less serious injuries. Lieutenant Collins and her team had performed remarkably under extremely difficult conditions, treating dozens of wounded Marines while under fire and with limited resources. Colonel Williams began planning for the aftermath of the attack, including damage assessment, casualty reports, and restoration of normal operations. However, he knew that Sarah's communication link remained essential until full systems could be repaired and tested. Her technical expertise and dedication had literally saved the base, and her actions would not be forgotten by anyone who witnessed them that night. The sun was rising over the Afghan mountains when Sarah finally allowed herself to rest for a moment. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew her work wasn't finished. The portable communication equipment had performed beyond expectations, but it wasn't designed for the extended high-power operations she had been running all night. Several components were showing warning signs of imminent failure, and backup systems needed to be prepared. James had successfully completed his mission to clear enemy fighters from the communication building, though his squad had taken casualties in the process. As he helped secure the area, he kept thinking about Sarah's dangerous journey across the compound and her crucial role in coordinating the defense. Her small figure carrying that heavy equipment had become a symbol of courage and determination for everyone who witnessed it. Colonel Williams approached Sarah as she worked on the communication equipment, noting her pale complexion and the blood-stained uniform. He had served for over 20 years and had seen many acts of bravery, but Sarah's actions stood out for their immediate impact on saving lives. Her technical expertise had been as important as any weapon in defending the base, and her courage in crossing the compound under fire had made it all possible. The damage assessment teams were beginning their work throughout the base, cataloging destroyed buildings, damaged equipment, and infrastructure that needed immediate repair. The communication building had taken multiple direct hits and would require extensive reconstruction. Sarah's decision to abandon that position and establish alternative communications had prevented a complete breakdown of command and control during the critical hours of the attack. Lieutenant Collins had finally caught up with the influx of casualties and was taking a brief break when she heard about Sarah's actions from wounded Marines being treated in the medical facility. Several of the rescued patrol members specifically mentioned hearing Sarah's voice coordinating their extraction and providing updates on medical evacuation status. Her calm professionalism over the radio had given them hope during their darkest moments. The portable communication equipment finally began showing serious signs of failure as the morning progressed. Sarah worked frantically to maintain connections while preparing backup systems, but she knew that complete restoration of the base's communication capability would require major repairs to the primary systems. The equipment she had carried across the compound had exceeded all expectations, but it couldn't continue indefinitely. Intelligence reports began coming in about the enemy force that had attacked the base. The assault had been planned and executed by a well-trained unit with detailed knowledge of the base layout and operations. The coordination and equipment they displayed suggested support from experienced military personnel, making the successful defense even more remarkable, given the surprise and intensity of the initial attack. Sarah's technical documentation and emergency procedures had proven invaluable during the crisis, but now she faced the challenge of transitioning back to normal communication systems while maintaining operational capability. The process required careful coordination with multiple units and precise timing to avoid communication blackouts that could leave the base vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The base's fuel depot was still burning, though firefighting teams had contained the blaze to prevent it from spreading to ammunition storage areas. The thick smoke created visibility problems that complicated damage assessment and repair work. Sarah had to adjust communication frequencies several times to compensate for interference caused by the intense heat and electromagnetic effects of the fire. James visited the command bunker to check on Sarah's condition and was amazed to find her still working at the communication equipment. Her dedication and technical skill had impressed everyone, but he was concerned about her physical condition. The shoulder wound needed proper medical attention, and she had been operating on adrenaline and determination for over 6 hours without rest. The rescued patrol units were providing detailed reports about enemy positions and movements they had observed before the attack. This intelligence was being coordinated through Sarah's communication links to higher headquarters, where analysts were working to identify the source of the enemy force and predict potential follow-up actions. Her maintained communication capability was crucial for this intelligence gathering effort. Colonel Williams received a priority message from division headquarters requesting a detailed after-action report and casualty assessment. The communication link that Sarah had established and maintained was the only reliable means of transmitting this critical information. He realized that her actions had not only saved lives during the attack but were continuing to provide essential capability for post-battle operations. The medical facility was gradually returning to normal operations as the most seriously injured Marines had been evacuated and immediate treatment needs were being met. Lieutenant Collins made sure that Sarah's injuries were properly treated, though Sarah insisted on remaining at her communication post until full systems could be restored. Her sense of duty and responsibility impressed everyone who worked with her. Sarah began training other communication specialists on the portable equipment systems, recognizing that the base needed backup capability in case of future attacks. Her technical knowledge and experience from the night's operations made her the most qualified person to establish these emergency procedures. She worked methodically to document everything she had learned about operating under combat conditions. The enemy fighters who had infiltrated the base had been eliminated, but security teams were conducting thorough sweeps to ensure no hidden threats remained. Communication with these security teams was essential for coordinating their movements and preventing friendly fire incidents. Sarah's communication links enabled safe and effective clearing operations throughout the damaged base. Repair crews began working on the main communication building, but the damage was extensive and would require several days to fully restore. Sarah's portable systems would need to continue carrying the primary communication load during this repair period, putting additional stress on equipment that was already operating beyond its design limits. She worked to implement power management and cooling systems to extend operational life. The psychological impact of the successful defense was becoming apparent as Marines throughout the base began sharing stories about the night's events. Sarah's courage in carrying the communication equipment across the compound under fire had become legendary, with details being passed from unit to unit. Her actions represented the kind of selfless dedication that defined the Marine Corps at its best. James was assigned to help coordinate the reconstruction efforts, and he made sure that communication requirements were given high priority in the repair schedule. He had witnessed firsthand how critical reliable communications had been during the attack, and he understood that Sarah's technical expertise would be essential for restoring full capability. Her small frame had carried equipment that saved the entire base. Intelligence analysts at higher headquarters were using information transmitted through Sarah's communication links to track down the sources of the enemy attack. The detailed reports and real-time intelligence that she had enabled during the battle were providing valuable insights into enemy capabilities and intentions. Her maintained communication link was contributing to broader security operations throughout the region. The base commander began preparing recommendations for awards and recognition for personnel who had distinguished themselves during the attack. Sarah's actions clearly merited the highest level of recognition, not just for her personal courage, but for the tactical impact of her decisions and technical expertise. Her story would become an example of how individual initiative and technical competence could determine the outcome of military operations. As the morning progressed, Sarah finally agreed to take a brief rest, while other communications specialists monitored the equipment under her supervision. Her exhaustion was evident, but she insisted on remaining available in case technical problems arose with the portable systems. Her dedication to duty and technical responsibility had become the foundation upon which the base's continued operations depended. The successful defense of Camp Phoenix had cost the Marines dearly in casualties and equipment, but it had also demonstrated the effectiveness of their training, leadership, and individual courage. Sarah's actions would be remembered as a defining moment when technical expertise, personal bravery, and dedication to duty combined to save countless lives and preserve mission capability under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. 3 weeks after the attack on Camp Phoenix, Sarah was back at her usual duties in the rebuilt communication center. The new facility was better protected and equipped with redundant systems designed to prevent the communication failures that had nearly proven catastrophic during the battle. However, everyone on the base knew that technology alone hadn't saved them that night. It was Sarah's courage and determination that had made the difference. The story of her dangerous journey across the compound had spread far beyond Camp Phoenix. Military communications networks carried the account throughout Afghanistan and back to Marine Corps headquarters in the United States. Details varied with each telling, but the core facts remained constant. A small Marine had risked everything to maintain the communications that saved her fellow Marines, carrying equipment that weighed nearly as much as she did through intense enemy fire. Colonel Williams had submitted a detailed recommendation for the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor that could be awarded to a Marine. The recommendation included statements from dozens of witnesses who had seen Sarah's actions and benefited from the communication links she maintained throughout the battle. The award process was moving through military channels, but everyone knew that official recognition was merely a formality. James had been promoted to sergeant and was now responsible for training new Marines in defensive tactics based on lessons learned from the attack. He made sure that every training session included emphasis on the importance of communications and the courage required to maintain them under fire. Sarah's story had become a central part of his instruction, inspiring new Marines to understand their responsibilities to their fellow service members. Lieutenant Collins had written a separate commendation, highlighting how Sarah's maintained communications had enabled successful medical evacuation operations that saved numerous lives. The coordination between ground units, air support, and Medical teams had only been possible because of the communication links Sarah established and maintained under the most challenging conditions. Her technical expertise had directly contributed to saving wounded Marines who might otherwise have died. The rebuilt communication facility incorporated many of Sarah's suggestions for improved emergency procedures and backup systems. Her experience during the attack had provided valuable insights into equipment performance under combat conditions and the human factors involved in maintaining complex systems during crisis situations. The Marine Corps was incorporating these lessons into training programs and equipment development across the service. Sarah had recovered fully from her physical injuries, but the psychological impact of that night remained with her. She often found herself checking equipment more frequently than necessary, and had developed an almost obsessive attention to backup systems and emergency procedures. Her fellow Marines understood and respected these behaviors, recognizing them as the natural response of someone who had learned firsthand how quickly situations could deteriorate. The intelligence analysis based on information transmitted through Sarah's communication links had led to successful operations against the network responsible for the attack on Camp Phoenix. Enemy commanders and their supporters had been captured or eliminated, significantly reducing the threat to coalition forces in the region. Sarah's maintained communications had contributed to strategic success that extended far beyond the immediate battle. Word came down through official channels that the award ceremony would be held at Camp Phoenix, with senior officers flying in from across Afghanistan to attend. The Marine Corps wanted to use the occasion to highlight the importance of technical specialists and the courage required in support roles that were often overlooked in favor of more traditional combat actions. Sarah's story represented the modern reality of warfare, where technical expertise was as crucial as marksmanship. As the ceremony date approached, Sarah learned that her family would be attending via video link from Marine Corps Air Station in Texas. The thought of her parents and siblings watching the ceremony made her more nervous than she had been during the actual battle. She had always been modest about her accomplishments, and the attention made her uncomfortable despite the obvious pride of her fellow Marines. The base prepared for the ceremony with the same attention to detail they applied to military operations. Marines practiced their ceremonial duties, and the parade ground was prepared to accommodate the visiting officers and assembled units. The entire base population would be present, along with representatives from other units throughout the region, who wanted to witness this recognition of exceptional service. James was selected to provide one of the witness statements during the ceremony, describing what he had observed during Sarah's dangerous journey and the impact of her actions on the battle's outcome. He had practiced his remarks carefully, wanting to convey not just the facts of what happened, but the inspiration her courage had provided to every Marine who witnessed it. Sarah's original communication equipment, damaged but still functional, after that harrowing night had been preserved and would be displayed during the ceremony. The portable radio and satellite communication gear had become symbols of technical innovation and personal dedication under fire. Military historians were already documenting the equipment and circumstances for future study and training programs. The ceremony day arrived with perfect weather and the kind of crisp mountain air that made Afghanistan beautiful despite its dangers. Marines from across the region had arrived to witness the event, and the parade ground was filled with service members representing every aspect of military operations. Sarah stood at attention in her dress uniform, the Navy Cross waiting to be pinned to her chest. Colonel Williams delivered the citation, his voice carrying across the assembled formation as he described Sarah's actions in formal military language that somehow captured both the technical details and the human courage involved. The words seemed inadequate to those who had been there, but they would become part of the official record that future Marines would study and draw inspiration from. When the medal was pinned to Sarah's uniform, the assembled Marines erupted in sustained applause that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. It was an unusual breach of military protocol, but no officer moved to stop it. The applause continued for several minutes, with Marines throughout the formation recognizing that they were witnessing something special, a moment that captured the very best of their service. Sarah's family watched from Texas through the video link, tears streaming down their faces as they saw their daughter recognized for courage that they were only now beginning to understand. Her mother had known that Sarah was in danger, but had never imagined the specific circumstances that would test her so severely. The pride they felt was mixed with retroactive fear about how close they had come to losing her. After the formal ceremony, an informal reception allowed Marines to congratulate Sarah personally and share their own memories of that night. Many told her things they had never mentioned before about how her voice on the radio had given them hope during the darkest hours, or how the coordination she provided had directly saved their lives. These personal testimonies meant more to Sarah than any formal recognition. The visiting senior officers took time to discuss Sarah's experiences and the lessons learned from the attack. Her insights were being incorporated into new training programs and equipment development projects throughout the Marine Corps. The technical aspects of her story were as important as the human courage elements, representing the increasing importance of specialized skills in modern military operations. James presented Sarah with a gift from the Marines who had been on the perimeter that night, a small communication device engraved with the names of everyone who had been saved by her actions. It was a personal token of appreciation that meant more to her than any official recognition. The device would travel with her for the rest of her Marine Corps career, a reminder of the night when her technical expertise and personal courage had made all the difference. As the day concluded and the visiting officers departed, life at Camp Phoenix began returning to normal routine. However, everyone knew that something fundamental had changed. Sarah's actions had demonstrated that heroism could take many forms, and that technical expertise combined with personal courage could be just as decisive as traditional combat skills. Her story would inspire Marines for generations to come. The 500 Marines who had been at Camp Phoenix that night, along with countless others who had heard the story, carried with them a new understanding of what it meant to serve. Sarah Martinez, all 5 feet 2 inches and 100 pounds of her, had shown them that size and strength came in many forms, and that the greatest courage was often found in those who simply refused to quit when everything depended on their success.